it, and it's live. Takes just a second over here. Bring this over here real quick. I'm going to hit mute. All right, folks, welcome to The High Note. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Ben Nacar, and he is Nacar, excuse me. Let me start that over here. Hey, folks, welcome to The High Note. We are a podcast dedicated to telling stories of musicians, composers, and people in the music business. And today I'm interviewing Ben Nacar, a composer, computer science, and scientist and musician extraordinaire. I really love your style and skill at playing the piano. And it's so impressive. You actually have a new album out, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But to get started, what got you inspired, Ben, about playing piano? Where did it all begin?
Well, so first of all, Chris, thanks for having me on. I was going to ask you how long you've been doing a podcast because I hadn't been aware of it previously, and you said I'm like your second guest or something. So you're really counting on me here to set the tone, I guess, for the podcast. But
Well,
yeah,
you
sure.
can say a guinea pig kind of, but no, we'll get started. You have to start somewhere, and
Yeah.
I love your music. It's
Oh,
got a lot of depth, and you've put so much into it, and your passion really comes out in your playing.
oh
And
well, thank you. I really appreciate that, Chris. Okay, so you wanted my origin story, basically. Um, I got started. So I had a rather unusual musical upbringing, I think. I was homeschooled basically all the way to through high school. And my dad did most of that. And that included learning how to play the piano. Practically everything I know today about playing the piano, I learned from him.
he's
And
a musician himself. Does he play out? What is?
so this is something that some people have a difficult time wrapping their heads around because he's not a professional musician and he's not a professional music teacher, but he is an extremely musical person. And he probably should have gotten a better musical education, but he really instinctively understands music. And his
That's not a picture of
professional
him behind you. That's your dad. No, no, that's sorry.
That's yeah.
Another
For
mention.
those of you who don't recognize him, that's Ludwig van Beethoven on the wall.
Beethoven.
Yeah, I probably should have gotten a picture of my dad put on the wall.
You can put it. He
Um,
gets a place up next to him, right?
yeah. Um, so yeah, my dad's professional background was in engineering, and he kind of brings that attitude to piano technique. Like if you want to hit a key loud or soft, I mean, this is just a bunch of levers with different masses and different rotational inertia and how do you transmit the force most effectively and all of that. And so he brings that very analytical approach to piano technique, but also he has a very good ear for making music speak most effectively given a certain set of notes. And yeah, he basically taught me everything I know about playing the piano. Now, usually when people have a kid that has some aptitude for music, the thing to do is you send them off to conservatory. And my dad got quite a bit of crap from some people for not putting me through conservatory. And, that's definitely an option for people. But even though it was pretty clear from the beginning that music was going to be a big part of my upbringing, my dad didn't want to lock me into any one particular career path. I mean, there's just so many things he figured that I could potentially do with my life, and he wasn't really hard set on me doing any one of them as long as whatever it was I picked, I was doing it well.
Mhm.
And in fact, what I ended up doing when I got to college was I studied computer science and classics. That's not classics as in classical music, but as in Greek and Latin. And don't ask me to translate anything now. All the vocabulary is basically gone out of my head at this point, although I do remember how to conjugate some verbs. But music ended up becoming my whole extracurricular life, basically. And I did all kinds of things from chamber music to accompanying musical theater rehearsals, which is actually something that I would highly recommend people try once in a while, because especially for people like myself who naturally suffer from stage fright, the nice thing about accompanying rehearsals is you're not in center stage, you're not in the spotlight, it's not a performance. the spotlight. If it's on anyone, it's on the singers. But they are really counting on you to keep the music going, and even if you aren't playing it perfectly, just do it well enough that they can follow along with the tune and the rhythm and so on. And so it's a really good training ground. And I've got some funny stories about accompanying rehearsals
Well,
for operas.
have you actually been the pianist for musical theaters?
Not in the
No,
pit.
not in the
I
pit.
was yeah. I was always backstage. By the time the performance happened, it was a full pit orchestra. Oh, no, actually, I take that back. There was one where I was doing continuo for recitative passages in an opera. So I was in the pit playing keyboard along with a cellist, but then most of the time it was the full orchestra playing.
Oh,
So that was basically it. And then I was also accompanist for some private sing-throughs of Les Mis and things like that. But
yeah.
I was never
Now
part of
just
a.
to kind of set the
Mhm.
stage for folks, you primarily work in the classical genre, as
Yeah.
opposed to more of the Broadway style musical theater kinds of things in that sense. I mean, because I've done a lot of musical theater traveling, mostly as a drummer, not as a pianist. And
Hmm.
oh boy, stories I could get into. That quite a wild thing when things happen, and the
Oh yeah.
canned orchestra and the rest of the group, the power goes out, and you're just the drummer playing. That's woo, good, hell of a dance tune. But anyways, my point is I'm sure you have you're it's in a different world than I personally experienced, but it's a very I guess traditional. Help people understand how that might be different than kind of traditional musical theater, Broadway types of things, in context, and then the experiences that you had doing some of those things, in more specifically with the stories, because I want to hear the stories.
Yeah, don't we all? So that's an interesting question because I never really thought of the world of classical music and musical theater as being all that different. I mean, a subset of classical music is opera. And opera, I think my guess is you're going to run into the same kinds of issues with I mean, so many things can go wrong in the middle of a performance. You just have to roll with it, keep the show going. There's temperaments clashing. And I guess the only difference I would say is there's maybe some stylistic differences in the music, and maybe it's considered a less formal sort of music. But I've never really been aware of that difference. Um, I was sometimes doing musical theater and sometimes opera, serious opera, and then sometimes it was Gilbert and Sullivan, which is kind of halfway between those two.
Mhm.
So for me, it all kind of blended together. To be honest, if you want some juicy stories, um, there was one I was going to share when I was the rehearsal pianist for, or several from this one particular production when I was rehearsal pianist for a production of Mozart's Così fan tutte, which happened not too far from where I am at the Park Theater in Cranston. And the music director for that was also the conductor of the Brown University Orchestra, which is how I knew him. And we were rehearsing in some of the strangest places. Most of the time, we were meeting at this warehouse that collected unused raw materials and sold them at a discount for educational purposes. And it, they had a very odd collection of pianos available. And this is just one of those other things where you have to roll with whatever instrument shows up. Oftentimes, I ended up having to play a keyboard, which I hated and which I still hate. But
Very different, very different. Some people, oh, let's learn piano. Let's get this young, get our young kid a keyboard. Well, it's not the same thing,
yeah,
not even
well,
close.
as a matter
Yeah.
of fact, I started on a keyboard because that was all my family had at that point. But
Mhm.
as it became clear that I enjoyed doing that or had a knack for it anyway, then my dad decided, okay, it's worth getting an actual piano.
Yeah, real piano. Well,
Yeah.
they're heavy and bulky and expensive to maintain.
Yes. Yes. Well,
Yeah.
at this rehearsal venue, I ran into a number of very strange instruments with temperamental keys all over the place that would sometimes work and sometimes wouldn't. And the very first night, I remember we started in on the first half of the opera, maybe, and just as we started, this is a warehouse where there's several floors, and I don't know what was beneath us, but they must have been renting out the space to other groups. And just as we were starting, some very loud Christian salsa music started emanating from the floor below. And we thought, okay, there's no way we can rehearse with this kind of distraction. So we shoved the piano into a different room and started the rehearsal again and continued it for a few minutes. And then the music started up again right beneath us. So they must have followed us. I don't know what was going on. But I, I decided, okay, this calls for revenge. And so when they came to a break in their music, I then started playing the orchestral accompaniment on the tiny little upright piano as loud as I possibly could, which was not very loud. But they
But loud
quieted down
enough.
after that. Yeah, they
Yeah.
quieted down after that. So I like to think that I scared them off. Um, then there was also the time when one of these pianos was made by Hyundai, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah, and it actually kind of looked like a shiny black race car with the finish, but it was not
Probably didn't
terrible.
play that way though.
Yeah, it didn't. I kept running into a broken key in one register, and so I would jump up an octave and just keep playing, and then I'd discover another sticky key over there, and I'd have to jump back around. And the conductor thought it was hilarious, and I did not see the funny side of it at all, at least while it was happening.
Well, now, so that's sticky keys that wants to stay down or that sort of
Yes.
thing.
Yeah.
But a technique, and I'm going to share this for the folks that might be listening to this. Sanford Moore was a fantastic pianist, musician from the Twin Cities. I played in little trios with him, and we'd go and we'd play at these little clubs, and they'd have the pianos. The notes didn't stick, but there was some clankers. Oh, so you don't want this chord with a clanker right in the middle. The
Wait,
trick
so when you
is
say clanker, you mean the
way
keys?
out of tune,
Oh,
like
oh, I see.
way
Okay.
out of tune. It's like, just so far out. Well, anyways, he would carry a roll of duct tape. And sometimes it was just two strings that were out. So he would duct tape the ones that were out. Clever trick for you folks that are, gigging folks that go out to these little pianos that kind of don't sound right. You can get your sound a little better if you just tweak with a little duct tape. Now the
Okay,
venue may
well, I
not
have
like
to.
that.
Yeah, I was about to say you got to clear it with them first, because
Shh,
even
don't tell
even
them.
even if you take the tape off afterward,
It leaves a
duct tape is
sticky residue. Yeah,
it
yeah,
it,
yeah.
it will, and I don't know what the long term effect of that is going to be on
Well, I
string.
kind of have a philosophical. If they didn't take the time to tune the piano for you, and you got a concert coming up, I don't
Well,
feel bad. Let them get a technician to take it up. It's okay. But that's another.
I have actually broken some strings, not in
Oh,
performance, fortunately, but there were some rehearsal pianos where they were just not cared for, and so some string had been rusty and was reaching a point of no return, and then I guess I just hit it especially hard. And there was one time I remember when I landed on a really loud chord at the bottom, and the key almost, or the string basically bounced out of the piano. It was one of the deep bass strings, yeah. But one of the things that my dad was always fond of telling me is, if you need to be a good enough showman such that if you show up and there's only half of a piano, you should still be able to put on a good show for everyone.
mhm. Well, you have to start doing your Victor Borgman.
Chris, sorry,
It's
I
like
can't hear you anymore.
boing. That's the broken string. Boing.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. He was a really amazing talent. Uh, I really respect his work because he had the skills, but then he just made it fun. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about what you're doing. A lot of people kind of, I don't want to be stereotypical here, but then you kind of look at classical music as, yeah, yeah, okay, it's kind of, it is what it is. I hear it on the radio at Christmas time or whatever.
Yeah.
But you have a way of you've been putting together these fun videos, and I encourage anybody that's listening to go check out your YouTube channel because you've got some wonderful videos and you're doing some really neat things. I mean, you have this song about train music and you wear the Casey Jones hat. You're just, you're not going overboard, but you're really making it fun. And that's the thing about, someone like Jacob Collier. He makes music fun, and you're making music fun. And tell me about that part of of your kind of philosophy towards music and what it means to you.
Well, one thing I will say is I don't consider classical music or any music to be sacred. I don't think the score is sacred. There's some schools of thought in classical music where, whatever the composer wrote, you have to be utterly faithful to it. And this is actually an attitude that's kind of waxed and waned over the years. There have been some schools of performance that have emphasized more that whoever's playing the music should bring their own personality to it. And then there's a reaction against that. And now maybe there's sort of a reaction against that. One of the performers that I listened to quite a lot growing up was Glenn Gould. And he's known for many strange things, including giving up concertizing altogether when he was 32 and becoming the first classical artist, and maybe the only one, I'm not sure, whose entire career was centered around making recordings. But he was also known for highly unorthodox interpretations. And I would be following the score and I'd notice, oh, he says that this passage should be played really loud and he's playing it really quietly, or vice versa. And nevertheless, because it was his recordings that I tended to listen to, I grew up with his way of doing things kind of stuck in my ear as what's normal. And then when I heard other people play it the way it's more typically played, I thought, oh, that just sounds so wrong. But this all contributed to a general idea toward music that you should just have fun with it. And if that means going completely against the grain, as long as you can make it, as long as you can do it effectively, such that if someone who had never heard it came along and thought, oh yeah, that's a convincing performance, then
Well,
I think that.
I guess there's a couple layers with that because you're talking in this case referencing dynamics or maybe
Or
changing the
phrasing,
tempos and those
yeah.
kinds of things. But there's also a stylistic thing. I was watching a really interesting interview. If you get a chance to see it, or maybe you have John Baptiste,
Hmm.
fantastic pianist, and he was being interviewed on 60 Minutes, and he was playing this classical piece. I think it was Chopin. I don't remember exactly what. He's playing this classical piece. He says, well, now we're going to turn it into jazz. And he turns the same thing, plays it jazzy. And he goes, oh,
Hmm.
okay, now let's take the same thing and we're going to turn it into a gospel song. And
Hmm.
so you have that other style. And there's been a lot of artists that have kind of played with that crossover, doing everything from, Electric Light Orchestra and some of these folks way
Hmm.
back that kind of started that trend of kind of, they were bringing rock and roll into, with classical. But
Right.
um how far do you go when you play with those kinds of elements in taking on an interpretation? I mean, you're not going to necessarily play a rock groove on if you're doing a solo piano, it's going to have, but how do you take uh those flavors, if you will, of style and bring them
Hmm.
in as part of your interpretation sometimes?
Well, I don't really think of it as trying to bring in different flavors. I mean, my background, as you were saying earlier, is primarily classical, and so to the extent that I would bring in any influence from, say, jazz playing or I don't know, musical theater performance, I'm not even thinking of it as such. I just thought of it as, oh, I heard some people play things this way, and it seemed like it might be a nice idea. I um
Well, there's a
yeah,
certain
I don't.
amount, if you're gonna play classical music, you want to have, without being a purist, you want to stay
Mhm.
true to the style and the genre as well. Unless it's specifically for that experiment, I guess.
I mean, I don't really think of it as that you have to stay true. I mean, it's been done that way before, and it's it's worth getting to know it that way.
Mhm.
But I mean, just one extreme example. About 4 years ago was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and I did a whole series of piano recitals, sort of in commemoration of that, in which I played various moon-themed pieces, including Clair de Lune by Debussy, which is, of course, one of these really overplayed pieces. And so I decided, okay, well, let's say if I can put a new spin on it in altogether. I mean, usually you hear people do it this. This very
Floaty.
calm and soothing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I did something like this and made it kind of not skittish, but more playful.
Some
And
yeah, playful is a great word. Tiptoeing
yeah,
with a fairy down the
I,
hall in the middle of the night.
yeah, and no one complained. A couple of people said that I made it sound fresh,
Oh, that's a
but
really neat thing to do.
yeah, I don't see why you shouldn't go out. And this is kind of Glenn Gould's attitude in a nutshell to performing something. Although some people say that he was kind of going out of his way to be uh, controversial in his development of some interpretation. But his attitude is not so much. Um, I actually, sorry, I was going to compare it to his attitude toward playing Bach on the harpsichord versus the piano, because some people say, well, Bach wrote for the harpsichord, not the piano, therefore we should only play Bach on the harpsichord. And then there are some people that say, well, if Bach had the piano, then he would have used it. And the Glenn Gould attitude is, why do we care?
Well, think about, I mean, I know, I do a lot more in the box or,
Uh
programmatically
huh.
with computer samples and so forth like that. And I noticed that you did some orchestrations recently, and we're going to talk about that. But
Yeah.
imagine what these folks would do with that level of genius and skill and insight with all the new toys and tools to
Oh
be able to
yeah.
get that real time. One of the things that I saw this interview of somebody talking about, jazz and classical comparison.
Mm-hmm.
He says that they're really very much the same. The difference is in classical, you're planning out, when you're a composer, you're planning out this composition
Mm-hmm.
and you're writing it down, and then other people are going to play it. So that's a long life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in jazz, you just did it in real time. You did that same kind of process in real time. Now, when you're taking a longer period of time, you can refine it and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really, you're creating a composition sort of as you're going along within this framework. And
Yeah.
now you got into music. I want to backtrack a little bit to
Sure.
memorable beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning of music, at what point did you say, this is my thing? Music is going to be my thing. Now you do other things as well, and I want to talk about that. Uh,
Yeah.
the technology side, because in relation to what you were saying, you've got this term disruptive as versus controversial. In classical music, it would be controversial. In technology, it would be disruptive. So well, I want to come back to that. But what do you see as that pivot point? We said, music is really where I want to have a strong footprint.
I don't know if there ever was really a moment. It was kind of a big part of my life from the beginning, and I didn't really think about um, the possibility of it not being such. Although what exactly I would do with it was um, that was not always clear. I mean, when I was 6 years old, I first went to an orchestra concert, and they played Beethoven's Eighth Symphony and something by Saint-Saëns and something by Mozart. And I think at that point I figured what I want to do when I grow up is write nine symphonies like all the greatest of them. And I haven't completely let go of that dream, but you know, um, it took me some time to get my head around the idea that nowadays, there isn't so much an audience for symphonies as there might be, say, for film music or video game music, something like that. There were, though, a couple of turning points in my experiments as a composer, which I don't think I really addressed because I was talking earlier about playing the piano.
Mm-hmm.
Um, to a very great extent, for whatever reason, my dad left me to my own devices when it came to composing, although he did give me some music theory textbooks to work my way through, which I barely remember any of at this point. And he would often give me some very generic advice, like, well, try to avoid doing such and such because it sounds cliched or something like that. But there were two kind of big turning points when it came to understanding the craft of composing. One was when I became aware of the Franz Liszt transcriptions of Beethoven's nine symphonies. And I always used to think, and I still feel this way somewhat, that orchestras always get the best repertoire. They get all the exciting things. And, we're stuck with these dinky little sonatas. Well, maybe some of them aren't so dinky. But coming upon Liszt's arrangements of the symphonies, and realizing that suddenly there actually is this way that all of this repertoire that I feel like I'm missing out on, it actually is at my fingertips. That was a big revelation, especially when my dad suggested, well, why don't you try writing your own transcriptions of something, especially because at age 8, Liszt transcriptions were kind of beyond me, mm-hmm. Even with regard to just how big my hands were at that point. But what I realized is that if you want to learn the craft of composing, I don't think there's any better way than by writing transcriptions of your favorite composers' works. It really forces you to get into their heads and think about what were they trying to do as you go through the process of taking whatever effect they were getting from an orchestra and trying to make it satisfactory on the piano. And to this day, writing orchestral transcriptions is one of my favorite things to do. In fact, if some violinist or cellist comes along and wants piano accompaniment in a concerto, I rarely just take whatever accompaniment arrangement they give me. I'll usually go back to the orchestra and rewrite it completely and squeeze in as many details as I can.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say, well, when you're saying that, I can only think about, okay, there's also probably this idea that they have in their head, and you've seen those things where they're crossing back and forth, and you've had to do some of those, I'm sure. It's like, well, okay, how the hell am I going to play this?
Yeah,
because I got this happening, and I got to get down there. I'm going to hit my nose down there, or what?
Right. It's all about having to make a lot of trade-offs, because the simplest thing to do would be you just copy every single note down and condense it onto 2 staves, but you often don't have that many fingers. And sometimes, in fact, it is more effective if you leave out part of the texture, because it just becomes a distraction. And sometimes, in fact, you want to add even more notes that aren't there, because maybe to get the same power as a whole violin section on one note, whatever, the only way you can get that across is if you double it at the octaves. Maybe that's just going to be a better representation of it on the piano. So that was one big turning point. The other one was about when I was 15 or 16 years old. I, for the first time, saw Star Wars, the original trilogy, that is.
That's why you have such a passion for John Williams.
So I always, up to that point, I kind of stayed away from Star Wars because I figured, it's so popular. Why should I get into something that is so popular? But I was very quickly drawn into the story, and I realized that the reason I was because of the soundtrack. And I bought the soundtrack album, listened to it quite a bit, and up to that point I figured film scoring is a lesser art compared to writing symphonies. And that film was when I first realized that, in fact, you can bring the artistry and craft that you typically associate with the great symphonist to the field of film scoring. And not just that, but if you go to a concert where it's all John Williams, usually they're going to be playing the big familiar melodies, and those are the parts that people usually remember. But if you actually listen to the soundtrack of any film of his all the way through, you'll notice that in, say, suspenseful parts or action-heavy parts, he's doing some really crazy stuff that is, Stravinsky levels of crazy.
Well, yeah, like you and I went to a concert this summer. It was at Williams, and I really appreciate you're the one that got me motivated to go out to it. Fantastic. And
thanks for coming.
I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh my God, this is, there's outside. So
Hmm.
they're not. I mean, you pray that the sound folks are really kind of pumping that up because it
Yeah.
so many reflections and everything like that. But they're all and I tease that I speak John Williams da 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 da. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there's all these little these really fast lines going on, and he's
Yes.
just the master at making those blend and work well. Where
Yeah.
like in writing, I write stuff for sync. If they all want to
Mhm.
hear whole note, half note, maybe an eighth note, for these melodic lines, and it's like,
Yeah.
maybe an ostinato in the background can have something a little bit fancy, but
Hmm.
it's a real challenge. But he was just a master at getting those really intricate. It was like he was trying to challenge the orchestra in writing stuff that
Oh yeah.
you're going to have to woodshed to get this right,
Yeah.
and
And it's not just the intricate rhythms and making something that's really challenging for people to play, but even to listen to. Like some of the really more atonal stuff that he writes, if you listen to it by itself, it's really unpleasant. But then you put it together with some big space battle on screen, it works. And I'm not saying that Williams is the only person that does this.
oh
Obviously, he's
yeah,
part of a
there's
whole tradition that includes, Jerry Goldsmith and going all the way back to Korngold and Herman and people like that.
yeah,
But the the idea that you could take all of these 20th century atonal techniques that I always hated listening to and still successfully embed them in what's ultimately a tonal framework that people can come back to was that was a big revelation for me. And I mean, Williams was basically my gateway drug, not just to the broader Hollywood tradition, but also to composers like Schoenberg and Stravinsky that I never used to enjoy listening to.
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So for a while, I not only did I um, spend quite a bit of time consciously trying to imitate John Williams in a bunch of stuff that I wrote, but ever since then, I've tended to approach composing programmatically, like very programmatically, even in some of the pieces where I don't specifically say, this is what I'm imagining going on. I usually have either some film in my, or some sequence of images in my head that I'm kind of writing to, or at least a sequence of moods that's very specific. And this goes back to right before college. So my sister, who's 9 years younger than I, we used to make up these endless stories about her stuffed animals, and it turned into this whole epic saga about basically a civil war among the stuffed animals. And we had
That's
plans
fun.
to we had plans
She's
to
I met
make
her. She was
yeah.
at the concert. She's a sweetheart. She's a wonderful lady.
I'll pass that on.
Yeah,
Um, so we were planning to make movies about this, and for me, a very big motivation for wanting to make these movies, which for the most part never happened, was so that I could go and write the soundtrack to them. And I
well,
did
that's your first
actually.
symphony right there. All right, there you go. I'm looking for it. I'm going to hold you to it.
Well, I don't know if that's ever going to get off the ground at this point, but it was a start.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, obviously, we all have these journeys, right? And we're taking
Yeah.
a journey, and I'm anticipating.
Hmm.
You've grown, okay, on kind of multiple levels. You have these great skills as a pianist. You've really accomplished yourself as a pianist. I imagine you can read, fly poop on a paper page. I mean, with that being able to do that, but then
It
also,
depends on whether it's atonal.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's just like hit as many notes as you can at the same time, right?
Yes.
Kind of. A lot of, anyways. Uh, but then you've also developed a style of composition and that I think is unique, very expressive and interesting. And then kind of that third plane is that you're also a computer scientist and you have this whole tech world that you deal with every day. Um, I'd like you to explain a little bit about your process as a composer and how you approach that. But before we do that, I want to connect with what was the biggest challenge along any of these journeys that you had to deal with. I mean, we all have a struggle somewhere. What was the most challenging thing that you ever dealt with on either of these Well, probably mostly musical or composition wise. What was the biggest hurdle that you had to overcome?
Probably it was simply adjusting to the whole idea of having two careers at once. And, I'm only doing this because it's really a chore to try and depend on music as an income. I mean, obviously, some people make it work. And the downside to doing this is that I don't have nearly as much time for practicing or composing as I would like. The upside is that basically I only work on what interests me when it comes to music. To the point that,
That's a
if
good
someone,
thing.
yeah,
That's a
to the
good thing
point that
because
if
you,
someone came along and suggested a gig for writing a score for a film, but didn't have really any any significant funds to pay for a score. Like if it was a project that pulled me in, then I would probably do it regardless of whether
of the
they
money.
were going to pay me anything. Yeah.
But it's good to
So
be in
it,
that position because otherwise you're playing, you're going to be playing weddings and other gigs
yeah,
that while yeah, they're paying and you're still playing music, if you're trying to focus, they distract from your focus because then you've got to prepare for all of that. And
right.
it's a whole nother it's a rabbit hole that you get pulled into as opposed to really being able to have a clear focus specifically to what you want to do in music.
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a clear focus because if you
Oh, a
work in
clearer.
tech,
What's
yeah, but
that?
if you work in tech, you will eventually develop ADHD.
Well, that's yeah, I know. I manage scatterbrain, okay? Because
Yeah,
I have four monitors. One track is over here, and then squirrel. Oh, okay, I'm over here, and then I'm lost and forgot what I was doing over there.
yeah.
It's the same
So
kind of thing.
yeah,
I totally
I
understand that.
yeah.
But
So I
it's
mean,
it's different though, going from tech stuff or
mhm.
in my case tech and business to to music. When I sit down to do music, I just like turn everything else off. And people get
Mhm.
pissed off because I don't answer my phone or whatever. This is I zone. And that's the
Yeah,
only thing I think you can get really in depth. I mean, do you
that's the ideal. I totally, if you can consistently do that, good for you. I haven't always been able to do that. Um, I'm getting better at it, but just that compartmentalization of okay, I'm at work. The problem is that for a long time I was working in what was a relatively laid back job at my alma mater, and there was plenty of brain space that even as I was working that I could
do other things or
um,
creative
there
creative?
was always something that was thinking about okay, I'm writing this piece of music, how do I want it to go here, or I'm preparing for this recital and I'm kind of running over a piece in my head.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I mean I'm not saying that all of the work I was doing there was easy enough that I could basically space out all the time, but it was just less stressful than the job I have now. So that's been um, kind of a shift
Yeah,
to get
challenge.
used
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
Well, but you're not playing a concert and going, "Oh shit, I forgot to turn that network switch off. I better get this like thing over here." You're not running through
No.
a procedure for a
Yeah.
technical thing you got to do while
Yeah.
you're playing a concert. You're getting that narrow focus.
Yeah.
So I guess it's okay if it goes one way, but not necessarily the other, right?
Yeah. I guess. Well, if you're practicing, then maybe that's where ideally if you're practicing, you can still set aside all of your brain power to just focus on everything. And that's difficult when the computer's in the other room and you're hearing Slack alerts come in and people are saying, "Oh no, something just crashed."
Yeah. When I was always on call, so when something went wrong at 3 in the morning, I'd be the guy that they call because I was
Ah.
the one that could like connect the dots with for everybody to fix it. So yeah,
Yeah,
well,
that
at least you're
that's
getting
tough.
sleep, right?
At least I'm not on call during the night. Yeah,
Well,
I
that's
can
good.
be very thankful for that.
So just share with folks what is it that you're doing technically right now?
So right now I'm working for Capital One in their auto finance division on a team that does what's known as site reliability engineering. So
oh wow,
think of it as we are we're the medics that show up if some system goes down. Like we don't know all the intricacies of how every single system works, but we know enough to do some diagnostics. We're the ones who get the initial alerts. We'll know which teams to page. And also, we're kind of the gatekeepers for people who are wanting to push out new features. There's always historically been this sometimes less than friendly tension, but hopefully most of the time friendly tension between the developers and the operators. And the developers have these features they want to push out because they're working on something and they're proud of it, or they've got some goals to set. And then it's up to the operators to say, no, we don't want to do any changes on a Friday because you're going to go home for the weekend. Something might go wrong. And then customers are going to be unhappy for several days.
Well, that's
So
awesome.
yeah. So it's um, we put up with a certain amount of stress compared to the developers teams, but on the other hand, I feel like we're more directly responsible for customer satisfaction.
Well, that's awesome, and
Yeah.
that I assume provides some stability and financially for
Yes.
doing some of the other things, which is good. And you obviously have some skill and you studied, went to college and became a computer scientist, I guess, and learned all the things that you need to know technically to be good at that job as well.
Some of
Well,
them.
yeah, well, it's
Yeah.
just like music. There's a journey, and then every time you figure something out, there's always 20 more things to figure out.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
what
there's
you
plenty they
figure out
don't.
is that you don't know everything. You got to learn all this, and it's always changing.
Yeah. There's always
And
plenty you don't learn in school, and you just have to pick it up along. It's sort of oral tradition.
yeah, and that's a good transition into kind of that next piece because I know from stepping away from music for 19 years, almost 20 years, that the music industry changed. The technology around it changed.
Hmm.
And you and I talked a little bit about this in the computer software and so forth. I think you use Ableton as your DAW of choice
These
at
days,
this
yeah.
point.
Hmm.
Um, and then you have you recently did a orchestration to one of the pieces that I believe you put out on your album,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
that was a beautiful, beautiful. Hey, by the way,
Oh,
quick
thanks.
quick plug for your album. His album is called Ben Nacar doing Ben Nacar, and it's really a wonderful collection of compositions, and some very skillfully executed piano pieces. But you did orchestrate this, and you
Hmm.
used some really unique library. Well, you used East West libraries from what you.
Yeah, I don't think those are unique. They're kind of
Well,
in
they,
some circles. I think they're considered like the gold standard, or maybe there's this
well,
other level, like there's the Hollywood Orchestra that it's
well,
another
there's a
extra
lot of
$1,000.
there's a lot of I don't want to say snobism, but there's a lot of people that, well, those sound old, or these sound, well, and sure, there's some
Uh
bits,
huh.
some sampling qualities that are good, but it's not, to me, I don't think that it's as much about the samples quality as it is in how you use the libraries. And I was really impressed listening to your orchestration. It sounded really unique, and maybe part of that was a little bit like it is because it is an older library, but it sounded very, very realistic in sounding like an orchestra. So even if the samples were, did you use the gold library or the?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So gold is supposedly, the older stuff, and they have the new diamond series, which is these higher quality samples. And there's something to be said about
Yeah.
each of these collections because they are an orchestra in their own sound, just like every orchestra sounds a little bit different in the
Yes.
hall that they are in or where it was recorded and all of that. But I thought you did a really good job of making it sound like that orchestra was playing your music. It was really well done. Tell me about the process in doing that and how you approach that, because I think a lot of the people that will listen to this, uh, they're doing that kind of thing, and they're trying to achieve that ability to sound like an orchestra.
Well, it's interesting
What's
you
your
ask me.
secret?
It's interesting you ask me that because I've been just from the beginning kind of fumbling around and figuring everything out on the fly. And I've been playing around with this software for sporadically, that is, for about 10 years. I think you saw one of my earliest attempts at film scoring. It was that romantic comedy bank robbery story where,
Cool. Well
yeah,
done. Very well done.
I think you saw that, didn't you? I'm
I
pretty
believe I saw we were talking in my other studio at the
possibly,
and
yeah.
you shared a link with me and I went and checked it out.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So that was my first attempt, and I think I've gotten somewhat better handle of how to make this orchestra sound more realistic since then. But if you're asking me how I do it, I mean, it's just such a tedious process, and I assume that it's the same for everyone who works with these, unless there were some other secrets that I just haven't stumbled upon. So I was going to ask if there are some plugins that just do a better job of overlaying some whatever they call it automation, where it's adjusting the volume on the fly. But what I'm doing is I'm having to look at often every single instrument at a time. And
Do you use a controller?
no, so I
This will
have.
save you. This will save you tons if you get one. This
Okay.
is handmade with love from France by Pierre. I'll give you the link later. In fact, I'll
Okay.
find the thing. It's called the Nuance, and it's just I only need the three, right?
Uh-huh.
Expression, volume, and vibrato.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but yeah, it's a
Interesting.
really simple one
So I
to
do
use.
have a MIDI keyboard which has some controls which might possibly be able to be used in place of that. But a lot of the time I'm writing my scores already in music notation software because I'm
Which one?
planning to. I'm using MuseScore at this point. I
MuseScore.
used to use Sibelius, and then some years ago my iMac died, and I decided to try and go all Linux for a while, and so that meant switching to MuseScore, and I've been pretty happy with it. For the DAW, though, there's that other one called Ardor, which has been good.
Dorico is fantastic because
Sorry,
it start Dorico
no, no. Oh, Dor. Okay, I haven't.
because Dorico is thinking like a DAW. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
you have a timeline view and then you also have your scoring view
Uh huh.
and you can connect with your library.
Okay, so well,
That's
that's so.
fantastic.
So can it connect with the VSTs or whatever that
Yes.
are put out by East? Okay,
Yeah.
because
So East,
I
West,
spent a lot
any
of
of them.
time. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do that with Ardor, and I
Mhm.
just couldn't figure it out. I mean, Ardor's great for when I'm doing my editing of just my plain audio recordings of myself at the piano, but I finally decided, okay, I need to set up a Windows box just so I can run Ableton, just so I can bring back the East West Orchestra. But I'll have to look into Dorico. Yeah,
You know,
that sounds good.
one of the things that I always find the most challenging,
Yeah,
and this is kind of the mistake that most people make when they're taking, trying to create strings and make them sound real,
yeah,
is that strings are they're not just playing one articulation. They're not just playing long or short. They're going back and forth and
right.
between several different articulations quite often, especially when if you, but knowing how having experience with doing various orchestrations and so forth
Yeah,
in a more traditional setting with violin and understanding the articulations, I think is a big place where people kind of make that mistake. Oh, I put a string patch in there.
yeah,
But if you know the nuance of those articulations that you want to put in there, and one of the things I need to look a little bit more into Dorico, but I'm assuming that it will do this, and that
hmm,
is as your if you're taking your and you're putting your articulations in
hmm,
writing it out, if you want to go from a spizzicato to
hmm,
longer legato type of thing over and change back and forth between these various articulations, you can do that and it will play it back
hmm.
based on that,
Is that the
it,
sort of thing that
depending on
they
which
do
one you
with
would do.
those? Is
You have
that
to
where
get a
you select certain keys where that it serves as a key switch and then
yeah
it
key
jumps
switch.
between?
You'd
Yeah,
probably have to use a patch that has key switching
yeah.
there, but
So
then there's
some
other
of
ways of doing
the
it.
yeah, some of the East West instruments come with that, but I never really got used to using those. It just seemed like more cognitive overload than just having about four different instruments stand in for a string section and then having one of them be spiccato and one of them be legato and one of them be tremolo and so on. And that's just how I've gotten used to it, splitting it all apart. And then I end up with, I don't know, something like 30 odd tracks
because
in
because you got four
because I'm
parts
split.
and
Yeah,
each of them have six
right.
articulations you're going
Yeah.
between. Yeah.
And then you end up with the really awkward situations where, you can tell there was a break in where they recorded the samples because all of a
Yeah.
sudden there's a slightly different attack. And so you have to make up for that by having all the MIDI notes have basically the same velocity and then just adjusting the volume by adjusting the volume as an overlay. So
One of the things
that's the
I
sort of
thought
thing that I end up having to do.
I would think would be, especially if you're to the folks out there that are not doing this a lot. One of the
Hmm.
things is to think about is to not get put into a position where you pick up a bad habit that you're going to have a hard time letting go of. So if it's going to be more productive for you to use key switches, but some people don't like key switches too, maybe
Hmm.
it's better if you're not. So whatever your habit that you start with is probably what you're going to stay with, because it just becomes comfortable for you. When it's possible there might be another way to do it that would be more efficient for the
Hmm.
style of whatever you're doing. So I hope people will kind of play with that.
Oh
um
yeah, I don't mean to suggest that the way I'm doing is the best way. This is you're just wondering what I found that worked for me. So
Yeah, no, that's
yeah.
awesome. No, and I'm not criticizing, what you're
Oh,
doing. That's I loved, what you did worked. It was fantastic. So
okay, good.
who you'd mentioned John Williams,
Yes.
but if you're looking at, let's take a more modern composers, and maybe
Okay.
folks in the scoring world, or doing stuff for films.
Hmm.
Who of the modern composers do you look up to the most and say, hey, they really inspire me to want to do more? I mean, in John Williams, it's hard not to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
you can't
really
just, but I'm just find somebody, who else besides him can have such a has an influence on you.
that's really difficult. I would have to place um, on maybe slightly below him, but same league. Um, well, Jerry Goldsmith is no longer alive, but I put him. I've been listening to him a lot more than John Williams lately.
Well, neither's
There's
Beethoven or Bach, but yeah, they still have an influence. That's okay.
yeah, yeah, but I've been trying to pin down what exactly Goldsmith does because a lot of his scores seem to have a bit more grit to them and maybe somewhat less tinsel than John Williams. And you don't associate Goldsmith with the same kinds of soaring melodies, but he has written some that really hit close to home. In fact, I think his score for Star Trek First Contact is one of the greatest scores ever written. Um, so there's him, and then there's
That
what
answered
is
my other question of what's your favorite score. So there you go.
the other one that I would put in a plug for is Joe Hisaishi, the usual collaborator with Hayao Miyazaki. I actually haven't watched any of Miyazaki's films all the way through, but I have listened to a certain amount of Joe Hisaishi in concert, and I love his stuff. It's really, I mean, this is stuff that follows directly from the classical tradition, but there's some contemporary twist to it.
Awesome. Well,
So
hey,
yeah.
one of the things, I'm going to switch over here for a quick rapid
Hmm.
fire. But before we do, one of the things, as you were growing up, you stayed really in that genre of classical music, and some
Hmm.
people would kind of like, oh, consider jazz the same thing that they would get into to jazz. But what
Yeah.
kept you from wanting to do, say, more pop music or jazz or other styles? What kept you, really focused and inspired on wanting to stay within this genre, and as the direction for your music?
Well, I wouldn't say that I was kept wanting to stay there. It's more that it was what came naturally. It's just the world that I grew up in. But that's not to say that I haven't wanted to explore other genres. In fact, I really like jazz, and I wish I understood it better. It's just I have no idea where to begin with it. I know some jazz pianists who've given me a fair bit of sheet music, lead sheets, and just to try to make sense of it. But the harmonic language is so different, and I always tend to think in terms of where are the notes on the page, or just in terms of um, the standard major and minor chords with maybe some stuff added in. But they might say, oh, here's a this is an F major chord to a jazz player. Oh no, I'm not sure, but like I said, I don't know jazz, but usually when they say F major, they aren't talking about a nice tonic position F major chord with nothing else added in. They're
I'll
usually
be like,
imagining something with the bass missing, and maybe there's at least one extra note, and maybe they've even flattened an A in addition to an A natural, or who knows what else.
or
And then there are
stacked
all
it
the,
in fifths, or
or yeah, yeah,
voices, stuff like that.
yeah. So I would love to understand jazz more, and it's
Well, I see
I'm
that
trying to.
within reach with all the skills that you have, and you're gonna. I think you're gonna be able to accomplish that and achieve that. Where there's a
If I
will,
can find the time.
yes. Well,
Yes.
that's the. Well,
Yes.
you're on the right trajectory, and you've got a beautiful CD and some wonderful videos that are fun up on YouTube. I think you're really on a good road forward, a good path. I think you're just going to need to stay consistent and keep working towards it, and you're going to pursue you're going to see the fruits of your labor definitely come forward. I want to jump into a quick rapid fire. So just,
Sure.
quick first thing that comes to your mind. I just got a couple things here. Um, what is your biggest musical influence?
Well, besides the ones I've already named,
Well, I was just kidding. Who's the biggest? Of course,
um, Bach.
oh, Bach. All right.
Yes,
Uh,
because I grew up on, for the first 3 years maybe, a diet of very strict Bach in terms of what I played, and to this day I still think very contrapunctally.
awesome. What is the
Yes,
story behind your favorite music composition that you've created?
that I did.
Yeah. What's this
What's
one?
what's the
What's the
story
story?
behind it? So it's interesting. The music composition that I'm probably proudest of is also one that, looking back, I think is flawed in many ways, but it still has a character that I've never quite been able to match. And this is, so you can go look for it on YouTube. There's a recording of it. It's titled Journeys, and it's basically a 20 movement piano concerto for piano and then string orchestra. And you can think of it as a film score without the film, or maybe a ballet without the dancers, but it tells an adventure story. And the idea I had for it came from going to an opera production where whoever was music directing had reduced the orchestra to just piano and strings, and he had given all the wind parts to the piano. So just try to imagine how that would sound and how that might kind of approximate a full orchestra. And that got me wondering, okay, just how far can you get with only piano and strings? And this piece was basically the result of that, combined with my fascination with film scores. And as I said, it's kind of an untidy piece, and it's got 20 short movements, but I think it's got some of the best music I've ever written, and I keep
Okay.
meaning to revive it.
If you could collaborate with any artist, living or dead, who would it be?
Living or dead? Uh, well, my biggest hero of all time. I mean, like I said, Bach is probably my biggest compositional musical influence, but my biggest hero is Franz Liszt, for the reason that people often dismiss him as a showman and a womanizer, but there's a couple important things about him. One is that he discovered a very rich, untapped field, which was solo piano recitals full length. He basically invented the virtuoso piano recital as we know it, along with taking piano technique to just an unprecedented level. So that's number one about Liszt. But number two is he's just, among composers, he was an extraordinarily generous person. And one one way in which this is manifest is at the age of 37, he was at the height of his career. He quit. He walked away from it feeling that he'd proven himself and that it was time for another generation of pianists to come and take over. And he devoted the rest of his life partly to composing, but also to teaching and helping the next generation along. And he taught for free. He would only take students that he thought showed promise, and he would teach them as long as they were interested and as long as he felt that he could impart something to them. And I mean, he'd kind of made it at that point. He made a fortune with all his touring. But
Awesome.
it's that kind of generosity of spirit. His whole attitude toward art and artists was that if you have a talent, you owe it back to the world to do something with it and help people along with it.
That's awesome. So
So that's living, or sorry, dead artists. I don't know if how I would imagine collaborating with Liszt, but he's certainly
perhaps
someone that I
if you were, you'd benefit by being a student.
I mean, just to be able to talk to him about music and hear him play. I mean, no one knows what he sounded like. We have recordings of his students because they lived into that time, but
Awesome.
no one
So
knows
what's a
about it.
piece of music that you wish you had written? You just go, I wish I wrote.
Uh, well, the soundtrack to Star Trek First Contact came to mind immediately, but I mean,
That's what I'm
from a
looking
young,
for, that first thing.
'cause I mean, from a young age, I mean, when I first discovered Mendelssohn, for example, he was the first person where I realized, oh my goodness, someone after Beethoven kept writing symphonies that were richly in a fairly classical, not so adventurous, but very familiar language, and it worked. And there were a lot of things by Mendelssohn when I was a kid. I wished I had written those.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we're just about ready to wrap up here. I
Mhm.
really appreciate you being a guest and hanging out with me for this time. Really interesting stories and quite a fascinating journey that you've been on. What advice would you give aspiring musicians or people trying to get into writing music for film and video or performing in the classical space or any other space?
Just never stop exploring and find people that anywhere that who might take an interest in what you're doing. And if you can't find people that you're interested in working with, just come up with your own projects. And you never know where you're going to end up, right? At this point, where am I going? I have no idea. It'd be nice if I could actually get a symphony performed on a stage or a film on a big screen or something like that. But I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just gonna have fun with music and see if I can get better at it. And I would encourage everyone else to do the same.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you again so much. Where can people find you and perhaps check out your CD or learn about you?
So my website is bennacar.com, so bennacar.com, and that links to everything else. My YouTube channel, which is In Search of the Muses, and my Bandcamp page, which will show the album as well.
That's awesome. Great album. Great conversation. Thank you so much, Ben. I appreciate
Thank you,
everybody coming.
Chris.
Hey, you're on a trajectory. We're gonna see you up there with some of those famous artists. Very.
Hey, well, if I
Is
do
it about
actually,
fame or is it about? It's about the journey, right?
yeah, yeah. But if if I do end up on Mount Olympus, then you can say, "Oh, hey, I was one of the first people who interviewed on my podcast."
Yeah, and then then we're gonna go and ski the Alps and drink lots of
No, nothing
scotch or something.
nothing that might involve falling down and breaking my wrists.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's true. I had when I was young, drummer, I had a skateboard and I wiped out and I went, "Ooh, no, not gonna do that again," because I just about took out my wrist. Yeah. So
Oh
anyway,
yeah.
we're gonna we're gonna wrap this up. Thank you for joining us on the high note. Be sharp and enjoy life. We'll see you on the next round here. Take care. Thank you, Ben.
Bye, everyone.